Nari woke before sunrise in the small house she once filled with laughter beside Jamo, the man who could calm a storm just by smiling at her. The town of Barita lay quiet outside, the hills still wrapped in early light. She moved slowly, trying not to wake little Lume, and told herself she could get through another day. Jamo used to tease her for always underestimating her own strength, and she tried to hold on to that memory the way someone holds on to a railing in a dark stairwell. When the knock came at the door, she felt it in her bones. She didn't need to look to know it was Madame Calany, her voice sharp before she even stepped inside, claiming the house and everything in it. Nari stood there with a soft, brittle laugh she didn't recognize, as if she were watching her own life from far away. Days passed with whispers in the market and eyes that followed her like shadows. Each night she cried quietly after Lume slept, then rose each morning ready to fight for the little girl who trusted her completely. One afternoon, while folding Jamo's shirts, she found a hidden envelope with his handwriting on it. Inside were his words and his will, promising she and Lume would never be pushed out of their home. Something warm rose in her chest, fierce and tender at the same time. When the judge later read Jamo's wishes aloud, the world seemed to steady under her feet. She walked out of the courtroom with Lume's hand in hers, breathing easier than she had in months. That evening she opened every window in the house, letting the Barita wind sweep through. For the first time since losing Jamo, she felt him there in the quiet, urging her to stay, to live, to begin again. Nari still remembers the morning Madame Calany came up the red clay path with two of her cousins. The air in Barita was bright and cool, the kind of morning when Jamo would whistle while boiling water for tea. Nari had almost reached for a second cup as habit, forgetting he was gone. She felt a small, shaky smile rise when she saw the visitors, because for a moment she hoped they were coming to comfort her or at least sit with her in the silence she had been trying so hard to fill. But the moment Madame Calany stepped inside, everything changed. Her eyes didn't look at Nari, only at the walls, the shelves, the floor, as if she was counting everything left behind. Before Nari could even greet her properly, Madame Calany said the house was not hers, that she should start packing, that it was only right for the family to take what belonged to the family. The cousins stood behind her like tall shadows. Nari felt something shift inside her chest, almost like she'd missed a step on a staircase. But she kept her face steady because Lume was in the next room humming to her dolls. She tried to remind herself that this woman had once kissed her cheek at the wedding, had once bragged to neighbors about how lucky Jamo was to find someone gentle and hardworking. Now she spoke to Nari as if she had been pretending all along. The words continued, sharp and cold, and Nari just listened. She could feel a strange laugh threaten to slip out, not from humor but from disbelief. She kept swallowing it back. At one point she whispered, asking why this conversation was happening so soon, but Madame Calany only said grief should not confuse ownership. When they finally left, the house felt smaller, like the walls had pulled in toward her. She stood still for a long time, listening to Lume's tiny footsteps pattering on the wooden floor. She didn't tell her daughter anything, only carried her outside to sit under the shade of the old Majamu tree, where Jamo used to tell stories about his childhood in Kelama. Nari ran her fingers through Lume's hair and tried to steady her breathing. She wondered how quickly love could turn into something that looked so much like hunger. For the next few days, the cousins walked through Barita talking loudly in the market, and Nari could feel the whispers follow her everywhere she went. Some people offered small nods of sympathy, others avoided her eyes. She cooked simple meals because her hands shook too much to prepare anything complicated. At night she lay awake remembering how Jamo used to lean his forehead against hers when they argued, whispering that no matter what happened, they were a team. The memory of his voice made her chest tighten and her eyes burn, but it also kept her from falling apart. She told herself she would wait, she would breathe, she would hold her ground until she understood what to do. Then one evening, when she was sweeping the front step, Lume came outside with a tiny giggle, holding a pebble she insisted looked like a heart. Nari laughed softly, so softly she surprised herself. She let Lume place the pebble in her hand, warm from her small fingers. In that moment Nari felt a quiet strength rise inside her, the kind that grows slowly, like roots under soil. Maybe she didn't know how the next weeks would unfold, and maybe Madame Callaney would return with more demands, but she knew one thing with complete certainty. She would not let fear decide the future of her daughter. Even in the heaviness, hope was still there, waiting for its chance to breathe. The days that followed moved slowly, the way smoke drifts when there's no wind. Barita was a small place, full of kind faces that suddenly felt sharper than she remembered. By the second morning, everyone seemed to know that Madame Callaney had come to claim the house, and Nari felt the weight of it every time she walked to the well or past the tailor's stall. Some neighbors gave her long looks filled with pity, others acted like they didn't see her at all. A few women whispered behind baskets of oranges, saying she had never really fit into the Callaney family, that Jamo had always been different for choosing her. She pretended not to hear, but the words clung to her mind like burrs. Still, she made sure to hold herself upright for Lume, who ran around the yard chasing butterflies as if nothing in their world had changed. At night, after she tucked her into bed and kissed her forehead, the house settled into a silence that wrapped around Nari too tightly, and she finally allowed herself to cry. She cried quietly so Lume wouldn't hear, letting the memories rise one by one. Jamo teasing her about how she cut mangoes crooked, Jamo hugging her from behind while she cooked, Jamo promising that no matter what happened, he would always protect her. She held onto those memories like someone holds onto a lantern in a dark field. Every morning she washed her face, braided her hair, and stepped back into the day as if nothing had broken. She swept the porch, cooked porridge, walked Lume to the school gate in Mavuko Row. She carried herself with a calm she didn't feel, and all the while she kept waiting for the sound of feet on the path, the next knock, the next demand. Some evenings she even caught herself listening for it, her heart jumping when a goat kicked a metal basin or when a neighbor called across the hill. But the knock never came. Not yet. Instead she got small reminders that life still moved forward. A boy from the market ran up to her with a flower he said Lume dropped. The old woman who sold cassava touched Nari's arm gently and told her she was praying for her. Even the village dogs seemed to follow her more closely, as if they sensed she was walking through invisible storms. By the fourth day, she found herself laughing softly when Lume smeared pap all over her cheeks and declared it a beauty mask. The sound felt strange in her throat, but real. On the fifth day, she woke before dawn and stepped outside to watch the first light slide over the Barita hills. She remembered how she and Jamo used to sit on the same step, talking about dreams they didn't have time to chase yet. The memory hurt, but it also warmed her, like a fire that stings and comforts at the same time. And so the week passed, a mix of dread and quiet victories. She didn't know what Madame Callaney was planning or when she would return, but she knew she would be ready. Something in her was growing stronger, even if she couldn't name it yet. Nari had felt the tension building all week, but nothing prepared her for the moment she saw Madame Callaney walking up the path again, this time with a stranger in a dark suit. The man introduced himself as a lawyer from Rowa, though he barely looked at her. They stepped inside without waiting for her invitation, and Madame Callaney went straight to Jamo's favorite chair, the one where he used to sit with Lume on his lap while telling silly stories about dancing goats and talking baobabs. Seeing her settle into that seat felt like watching someone touch a wound that hadn't healed. She spoke calmly, almost sweetly, telling Nari she had until the end of the week to pack her things. The lawyer added that it was simple, really. The house belonged to the Callaney family and always had. Nari stood frozen with Lume in her arms, her hands trembling so much she worried she might drop her. She tried to explain, tried to remind them that this was the home she built with Jamo, the place where he laughed and prayed and lived his final moments. But the lawyer kept repeating the same line, as if he was reading it off a piece of paper. Madame Callaney only nodded, her eyes wandering around the room like she was already choosing what to keep. When they finally rose to leave, the lawyer gave her a tight smile, and Madame Callaney patted her on the arm as if she were a child refusing to accept a lesson. The door closed behind them with a soft click, but it felt like an explosion inside her chest. The silence that followed didn't feel like peace. It pressed down on her shoulders and wrapped around her throat. Lume whispered, asking if everything was all right, and Nari forced a smile that fell apart as soon as her daughter ran to her room. She sank to the floor, her back against the wall, her breath shaking, her eyes burning. She thought of all the nights she and Jamo had talked about their future here in Barita, how he had painted every corner of the house himself, how he had danced with her in the kitchen after Lume was born, barefoot on the cold tiles. The memories felt like warm hands, but they couldn't hold her up. She curled her fingers into the fabric of her dress and tried to breathe through the fear. What would happen to Lume if they lost their home? Where would they go? Who would protect them now? Minutes passed, or maybe hours. She wasn't sure. The sun moved across the window, and the room slowly softened into evening light. At some point, Lume came back, carrying her little wooden bird carved by Jamo. She placed it in Nari's lap and pressed her forehead against her mother's. Nari let out a soft laugh, tired but real, and pulled her close. That small touch reminded her she wasn't alone. Even with her heart breaking, she knew she needed to stand up again. For Lume. For the life Jamo believed she could hold together. She whispered a promise into her daughter's hair, a promise she wasn't sure how to keep yet, but one she would fight for with everything she had. Nari waited until Lume had gone outside to play before she pulled Jamo's old drum bag from the top shelf. She wanted to feel close to him again, even if it meant touching the shirts that still carried the faint scent of shea oil and dust from the Barita hills. She sat on the floor and folded each cloth slowly, almost like she was smoothing her own heartbeat. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that made her think too much about the future and all the doors that seemed to be closing at once. Madame Callaney's visit from 2 days before still echoed in her mind, especially the way the lawyer kept repeating those cold words. Nari tried to steady herself by whispering Jamo's old jokes, the ones he used to tell when she was stressed, but her voice cracked halfway through. She pressed her forehead to one of his shirts and let herself breathe him in. That was when her fingers brushed something stiff inside the drum bag. She frowned, reached deeper, and pulled out a sealed envelope that had been tucked into a hidden pocket she had never noticed. For a moment she just stared at her name written in Jamo's handwriting, the curves familiar and warm, like he had written it only yesterday. Her breath caught, and she sat completely still, as if moving too fast would make it disappear. She opened the envelope with slow, trembling hands. A copy of a will slid out, along with a small note. She read the note first, her eyes moving carefully over every word he had left her. He wrote that he loved her, that he trusted her, that he had prepared everything so she and Lume would never be left without a home. He told her not to worry, that the house was hers, that he had signed every paper and spoken to every official needed. He ended by saying he hoped she would find this when she needed it most. Nari closed her eyes, and for a brief second she almost felt his palm against her back the way he used to steady her when she was scared. Relief washed through her so quickly it left her dizzy. Her hands shook, but not from fear this time. It was something else, something bright and painful and beautiful all at once, as if her heart was breaking open and healing at the same time. She laughed softly through her tears, a strange mix of joy and sadness that filled the room like warm light. She held the papers against her chest, letting the truth settle into her bones. She wasn't imagining protection. Jamo had actually planned for her future, for Lume's future, for this exact moment. She imagined him sitting at the table months ago, writing the note with that small smile he always had when he was doing something for them. Nari wiped her face and stood up slowly, feeling taller than she had in weeks. Outside, she could hear Lume laughing with the neighbor's children, a bright, clear sound that made her smile. She stepped out onto the porch and watched her daughter run through the dust with her arms wide open. For the first time since everything began, Nari felt the ground beneath her steady. She wasn't powerless. She wasn't lost. She had her daughter. She had her home. And she had Jamo's final promise folded safely in her hands. Nari didn't sleep the night before she visited Sorani, the quiet advocate who worked from a small office behind the maize mill. She walked there early in the morning with the will pressed against her chest, terrified she would drop it or wake up to find it had all been a dream. Sorani welcomed her inside with calm eyes and soft words, the kind that immediately slowed her heartbeat. Together, they sat at a wooden table covered with old files, and Nari watched as he read through Jamo's will with the careful attention of someone handling something sacred. Every few minutes he asked gentle questions, making sure he understood each detail. Nari answered as steadily as she could, though her voice shook from both hope and fear. When they finished, Sorani nodded and told her what they needed to do next. His voice didn't rise or fall dramatically, but the quiet certainty in it made her feel less alone. They filed the petition the same afternoon, and Nari walked back to Barita with a strange mix of terror and strength swelling inside her. For the first time since Jamo's death, she felt like she was walking towards something instead of running from something. The court hearing in Rowa came a week later. Nari traveled with Sorani on a crowded bus that bounced along the long road between the hills. She held Lume's small hand the entire way, feeling the child's warm fingers relax and tighten with the rhythm of the ride. When they arrived, the courthouse felt enormous, its stone steps rising like a mountain. Nari's legs shook as she climbed them, but Sorani walked beside her with steady steps. Inside, Madame Kalani was already waiting with her cousins. She carried the same confidence she had brought to Nari's doorstep, her chin high, her smile tight. When she glanced at Nari, it was with the same dismissive look that had once cut Nari so deeply. But today, something inside Nari felt different. She wasn't empty. She wasn't alone. She had Jamo's words in her hands and her daughter by her side. The hearing began, and for a while everything blurred. Papers rustled. Lawyers spoke. The judge asked questions. Nari answered softly when needed, though her voice trembled more than she wished. Madame Kalani interrupted often, insisting the land belonged to the family, insisting Nari was confused, insisting Jamo would never put such things in writing. Then the judge lifted the will, his eyes scanning it slowly, and the whole room seemed to lean toward him. When he began reading it aloud, every breath in Nari's body stilled. The words flowed gently at first, then grew sharper with each line that confirmed Jamo's intention. And then came the sentence that changed everything. The house and all its land belonged fully to Nari and Lume, not shared, not temporary, fully, completely, hers. The courtroom fell silent. Madame Kalani's face shifted in a slow, painful collapse, like someone watching a wall they had trusted suddenly crumble. She opened her mouth, but no words came. Nari felt her own breath return to her chest, as if she had been underwater for weeks, and was only now breaking the surface. Her eyes filled, not with tears of grief, but with something cleaner, lighter. She squeezed Lume's hand and felt the child squeeze back. For the first time in so long, Nari could breathe without pain. She stood straighter than she had in months, and as they walked out of the courtroom into the bright Rowa sunlight, she felt Jamo's love like a warm hand at her back, guiding her into the life he had protected for her all along. The sun outside the Rowa courthouse felt warmer than Nari expected, as if the day itself wanted to remind her she had survived something heavy. She stepped onto the wide steps with Lume's small hand tucked in hers, still feeling the echo of the judge's words in her chest. Before she could take another breath, she heard someone call her name. Madame Kalani stood a few steps away, her cousins hovering behind her like unsure shadows. The woman who had walked into the courtroom with so much confidence now looked smaller, her shoulders pulled in, her eyes unfocused. When she tried to speak, her voice cracked on the first syllable, and for a moment she looked almost fragile. She told Nari she never understood why Jamo chose her, that she expected him to follow the path the family laid out for him. She said she thought Nari had taken him away from them. Then she shook her head as if she couldn't hold the words anymore. Nari listened quietly, not out of fear and not out of hurt, but because she suddenly realized she no longer needed anything from this woman. Not her approval, not her apology, not even her anger. Lume squeezed her hand gently, and Nari felt a calm rise inside her like a slow tide. When Madame Kalani finally stopped speaking, Nari simply thanked her for coming, her voice steady in a way it hadn't been in months. She didn't argue or explain. She just turned away and walked toward the road with her daughter beside her, each step feeling like she was shaking off another piece of the weight she had carried. As they reached the edge of the courtyard, Nari's phone began to buzz. It was the baker from Barita calling to say he heard the news and that Jamo would be smiling wide if he were here. Then came a message from her neighbor, Lolly, promising to cook a pot of stew to celebrate when Nari got home. Another call followed from a staff member at Lume's school, telling her how proud everyone was of her strength. Each voice felt like warm hands lifting her, soft reminders that she wasn't as alone as she once believed. She laughed quietly as she answered them one by one, surprised at how natural the sound felt after so many weeks of fear. Lume swung their joined hands back and forth as they walked, humming a little song she made up about winning and walking and sunshine. Cars passed on the road, and the hills of Rowa stretched into the distance, glowing in the afternoon light. Nari breathed it all in slowly, letting the air fill her chest without resistance. When they reached the bus stop, she lifted Lume onto her lap and watched people rushing around them, each carrying their own stories and battles. She thought about Jamo, about the way he always believed she was stronger than she knew. She felt him in that moment, not in a painful way but in a warm, steady way, like someone's arm around your shoulders when you're tired. By the time the bus rumbled toward Barita, Nari wasn't thinking about fear or loss or what she had survived. She was thinking about the life waiting for her at home, the windows she would open, the meals she would cook, the laughter she would let fill the rooms again. The moment everything turned wasn't loud or dramatic. It was simple. It was her choosing to walk forward, carrying her daughter, her truth, and the quiet confidence that she had finally taken her life back. When Nari returned to the house in Barita, the air felt different, as if the walls had been waiting for her. She pushed open every window until the wind rushed through the rooms, lifting the curtains and carrying out the heaviness that had been sitting there for weeks. Lume ran from room to room, laughing as the breeze brushed her hair, and Nari felt something warm rise in her chest. She cooked her daughter's favorite meal, a simple pot of spiced rice and okra, filling the house with a smell that reminded her of quieter days. As the sun began to set, she found one of Jamo's old lamps on the shelf, the metal a little rusted but still strong. She lit it carefully and carried it out to the porch, placing it in the exact spot where he used to sit on warm evenings, humming and tapping his fingers on his knee. She settled into the wooden chair beside it, listening to the night sounds of Barita. Crickets singing, distant laughter, the soft rumble of a passing motorbike on the lower road. The sky stretched wide and gentle above her, and for the first time in a long while, she didn't feel like she was holding herself together with fragile strings. She felt Jamo's presence, not like a wound but like a soft hand resting on her shoulder. The grief was still there, but it had changed shape. It no longer drowned her. It sat quietly beside the love she carried and the peace she had fought so hard to find. Lume curled up at her feet with a small blanket, humming sleepy melodies. Nari looked around the porch, the yard, the hills beyond, and knew deep in her bones that this was where she was meant to stay. This was the home Jamo built for them, the home he protected even after he was gone. And now she was ready to live in it again.